The desert sun was merciless on the day Jack Marlowe brought in the Garrett brothers. Their bodies draped across their horses like sacks of grain. $3,000 in bounty money, paid in full at the sheriff's office in Tombstone. No one asked questions when Marlowe collected. No one ever did. He had a reputation that preceded him like the smell of gunpowder, a man who always got his quarry, dead or alive. Mostly dead. The townsfolk would watch from behind their curtains as he rode through with his grim cargo, and they'd whisper his name with equal parts fear and admiration. But reputation, as Marlowe would learn, was a double-edged blade that could cut both ways. Marlowe had been hunting men for 7 years, ever since the war ended, and left him with nothing but a Colt revolver and an understanding of violence that most men never acquire. He'd started with small bounties, drifters and horse thieves, working his way up to the notorious outlaws whose faces decorated wanted posters in every territory from Texas to California. He told himself he was on the side of law and order, that every man he brought in deserved what he got. The money was good, but it wasn't about the money. At least that's what he believed in the beginning. The turning point came in a town called Redemption, a cruel joke of a name for a place where hope went to die. Marlowe rode in tracking a man named Vincent Calhoun, wanted for bank robbery and murder, $5,000 on his head. The trail had gone cold weeks ago, but Marlowe had patience and instinct. He found Calhoun in the back room of a saloon called the Brass Eagle, playing cards with 3 other men. Marlowe kicked open the door with his gun drawn, and Calhoun reached for his weapon. The gunfight was over in seconds. When the smoke cleared, Calhoun lay dead on the floor, along with one of the other card players who'd made the mistake of going for his gun. Marlowe collected Calhoun's body and rode to the sheriff's office, expecting his usual transaction. But Sheriff Dalton, a pot-bellied man with cold eyes and a star that looked too heavy for his vest, had other ideas. He inspected Calhoun's corpse and smiled. Then he told Marlowe the bounty had been reduced to $2,000. Some clerical error, he claimed. The territorial governor had reassessed the value. Marlowe knew a lie when he heard one. But what could he do? The law was whatever men like Dalton said it was. Marlowe took the $2,000 and left, but something had shifted inside him. He'd risked his life for that bounty, tracked Calhoun across 3 territories, killed 2 men in the process. And some corrupt sheriff had decided his work was worth less than promised. That night, Marlowe sat in his hotel room, counting the money. And for the first time, he let himself think thoughts that had always been there, waiting in the shadows of his mind. If the law could change the rules whenever it suited them, why should he play by any rules at all? 3 weeks later, Marlowe was tracking the Dawson gang for brothers who'd robbed a series of stagecoaches across Arizona territory. The wanted posters promised $8,000 for all 4, dead or alive. Marlowe found them holed up in an abandoned mine outside of Silver Creek. He could have waited for dawn, could have called for backup from the local authorities. Instead, he went in alone at midnight, his steps silent on the rocky ground. He killed 3 of the brothers in their sleep, put bullets in their heads before they could even wake up. The 4th, the youngest, opened his eyes just as Marlowe's gun barrel pressed against his forehead. The boy couldn't have been more than 19. He begged for his life, swore he'd only been with his brothers because he had no choice, promised he'd never robbed anyone himself. Marlowe looked into those terrified eyes and felt nothing. He pulled the trigger and watched the boy's head snap back against his bedroll. Later, Marlowe would tell himself it was justified, that wanted posters didn't specify which Dawson brothers were more or less guilty. But he knew the truth. He'd murdered a sleeping boy because it was easier than taking him alive, because dead men didn't require feeding or watching or transporting. Because he'd stopped seeing these men as human beings
That's
and
a lot of
started
money.
seeing them
More where
as
that
inventory.
came from.
The
I'm not interested
$8,000
in your
bought
bribes.
Marlowe a new horse, a fine black stallion with speed and stamina. It also bought him a taste for efficiency that began to look a lot like cruelty. His next 3 bounties all came in dead, and each time Marlowe's explanation was the same. They'd resisted. They'd drawn first. What else could he do? The sheriffs accepted his stories because they had no reason not to. Marlowe was a known quantity, a reliable hunter who got results. If his methods had become more brutal, well, these were brutal times. But efficiency wasn't enough anymore. Marlowe had tasted how arbitrary the law could be, how men in positions of authority could manipulate it for their own gain. If Sheriff Dalton could pocket $3,000 that rightfully belonged to Marlowe, why couldn't Marlowe take a cut of his own from a different source? The thought came to him while he was transporting a train robber named Samuel Pike back to Santa Fe. Pike had stolen $20,000 in gold certificates from a Union Pacific train. The certificates were never recovered. Pike, bloodied and tied to his saddle, kept insisting he'd hidden them somewhere safe, somewhere no lawman would ever find them. They camped for the night in a canyon 30 miles outside Santa Fe. Marlowe built a fire and sat across from Pike, studying the man's bruised face in the flickering light. Then he asked where the certificates were hidden. Pike laughed through broken teeth and said he'd die before telling. Marlowe believed him. So Marlowe made a different offer. Tell me where the money is, and I'll let you go. We'll say you escaped in the night. Pike studied Marlowe's face for a long moment, trying to determine if this was a trick. But desperation makes men want to believe, and Pike was desperate. He told Marlowe about a cave in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, gave him detailed directions, made him repeat them back twice. Then Marlowe shot him in the chest and watched him die. He brought Pike's body into Santa Fe the next morning and collected the $1,500 bounty. Then he rode to the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and found the cave exactly where Pike had described. The gold certificates were there, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden under a pile of rocks. $20,000 that no one knew existed anymore except for Marlowe. He took the certificates to a banker in Denver who asked no questions and converted them to cash for a 20% commission. Marlowe rode away with $16,000, more money than he'd made in 3 years of hunting bounties. That $16,000 was the poison that finished killing whatever remained of Jack Marlowe's conscience. He'd crossed a line he could never uncross, and the crossing had been so easy, so profitable, that he couldn't convince himself it was wrong. If Pike had been smart enough to keep his mouth shut, he'd have gone to trial and probably hanged anyway. Marlowe had just expedited the process and claimed what would have otherwise been lost to time and bureaucracy. That's how he justified it to himself during the day. At night, in the moment between waking and sleeping, he sometimes saw Pike's face as the light left his eyes. But those moments became less frequent as the weeks passed. Word spread through the outlaw community that Jack Marlowe had become even more dangerous.
Stage was hit. We
That
ride
he no
now.
longer made any effort to bring men in alive. His reputation, once feared but respected, transformed into something darker. Wanted men began to run at the mere mention of his name. Some tried to organize, to band together for protection. Marlowe hunted them anyway, now with a calculation that had nothing to do with justice. Before he brought anyone in, he'd interrogate them about money, about hidden stashes, about accomplices who might be holding stolen goods. Most had nothing to tell him. Those who did rarely lived long enough to regret their confessions. The Keller job was where Marlowe's transformation completed itself. Thomas Keller was a former banker who'd embezzled $70,000 from a mining operation in Colorado
Careful.
and
Agreed.
fled
The map
west.
shows a trail
The
here.
bounty was
Good.
substantial,
You leave it dawn.
$10,000. But that wasn't what interested Marlowe. It was the $70,000, money that had never been recovered, that Keller supposedly had hidden somewhere. Marlowe tracked him to a small ranch outside Albuquerque, where Keller was living under the name Thomas Garrett, posing as a cattle buyer. Marlowe didn't bring Keller in immediately. Instead, he waited and watched, studying Keller's routine, looking for clues about where the money might be hidden. He broke into Keller's house one night while the man was in town and searched every inch of it. Nothing. He followed Keller for a week, watching him ride out to various locations, checking fence lines and water sources. Still nothing. Finally, Marlowe's patience ran out.
Time to move.
He confronted Keller in a box
Easy,
canyon
boy, we're almost
5
out.
miles from the ranch, gun drawn, demanding to know where the money was hidden. Keller, a thin man with nervous hands and a receding hairline, swore he didn't have it anymore. He'd spent it all, he claimed, buying the ranch and the cattle and establishing his new identity. Marlowe didn't believe him. He pistol-whipped Keller until the man's face was a mask of blood, demanding the truth. Keller kept insisting there was no money left, that it was all gone. Marlowe beat him for another hour, until his own knuckles were raw and Keller could barely speak through his broken jaw. Finally, Marlowe realized the man was telling the truth. The money was gone, spent over 3 years of careful living and investment in a new life. Marlowe shot Keller and left his body in the canyon. He didn't even bother collecting the bounty. $10,000 seemed like an insult after what he'd been through, after what he'd become. He rode away from that canyon knowing he'd tortured and killed a man for money that didn't exist and feeling nothing but frustration at the waste of his time. That was the moment Jack Marlowe understood he was no longer a bounty hunter who sometimes crossed lines. He was a criminal who occasionally collected bounties. The authorities didn't notice the change immediately. Marlowe was still bringing in wanted men, still collecting his payments, still operating within the broad parameters of frontier justice. But other bounty hunters began to notice. They'd hear stories about Marlowe's methods, about suspects who died in
state your business.
Suspicious
Here to make a deposit, a large one.
About wanted
Very well,
men
let's see
who
it.
seemed to be
Proceed.
interrogated before they were killed. A few of the more righteous hunters tried to confront Marlowe, to warn him he was going too far. None of those confrontations ended well. Marlowe's gun was faster than his conscience, and he had no tolerance for men who questioned his methods. Then came the Baxter brothers, and everything unraveled. The Baxters were small-time outlaws, cattle rustlers with $1,000 bounty split between them. Marlowe wouldn't normally have bothered with such a paltry sum, but he was between jobs and happened to be in the territory. He tracked them to a homestead north of Cheyenne, a small farm where they were staying with their sister and her family. Marlowe rode in at dusk, planning a simple capture. But when he kicked in the door, he found not just the 2 brothers, but the sister, her husband, and their 3 children sitting down to dinner. The smart move would have been to wait, to catch the brothers alone. But Marlowe had stopped making smart moves. He'd started making efficient moves. He drew his gun and ordered the brothers to come quietly. The older Baxter, a man named Clayton, stood up slowly with his hands raised. The younger one, Robert, went for a gun tucked into his belt. Marlowe shot him in the chest before the weapon cleared leather. The children started screaming. The sister's husband lunged at Marlowe, unarmed but desperate to protect his family. Marlowe shot him too, a reflex born from years of treating any sudden movement as a threat. Clayton Baxter charged at Marlowe with a knife he'd grabbed from the table. They fought, crashing through furniture while the sister gathered her children and fled into the night. Marlowe managed to get his gun up and shot Clayton twice, once in the stomach and once in the throat. The man died, gurgling on his own blood, while Marlowe stood over him, breathing hard, realizing what he'd just done. He'd killed a family man in front of his children over a $500 bounty. He'd murdered an unarmed homesteader who'd just been trying to protect his family. Marlowe left the bodies where they lay and rode hard for the border. But the sister had seen his face, knew his name, and she told the authorities everything. Within a week, wanted posters bearing Jack Marlowe's likeness were circulating through every territory. The bounty on his head was $15,000, dead or alive. The hunter had become the hunted, and there was a certain poetry to it that Marlowe might have appreciated if he'd been capable of appreciating anything anymore. He spent 3 months running, using every trick he'd learned from hunting men to avoid the hunters, now tracking him. He changed his appearance, grew a beard, dyed his hair, wore spectacles. He avoided towns where he might be recognized, stuck to the remote territories where law enforcement was thin and memories were short. But the network of bounty hunters was vast, and $15,000 was enough to make even casual acquaintances into potential betrayers. Marlowe found himself sleeping with one eye open, trusting no one, seeing
Evening,
threats
folks. Mind if
in
we join?
every shadow.
Not at all. Come
The
on up.
irony was that he still had money, still had the $16,000 from Pike certificates, plus various other amounts he'd taken over the years. He could have fled to Mexico or South America, could have started a new life somewhere the wanted posters couldn't reach. But something kept him in the territories, some stubborn pride or death wish he couldn't name. He told himself he was waiting for things to cool down, for some new outrage to distract the authorities. But the truth was simpler and more pathetic. Jack Marlowe didn't know how to be anything except what he was, and what he was had no place outside the violent machinery of the frontier. His end came in a town called Perdition, another ironically named settlement clinging to existence in the New Mexico Badlands. Marlowe rode in needing supplies, planning to stay less than an hour. He kept his hat pulled low and his head down, browsing the general store while the proprietor gathered his order. He was almost out the door when he heard a voice behind him say his name. Not Thomas Garrett or any of the other aliases he'd been using. His real name, Jack Marlowe. He turned to see Deputy Marshal Frank Holloway standing in the doorway, a shotgun cradled in his arms. Holloway was young, maybe 25, with a kind of clean-cut face that suggested he still believed in things like justice and righteousness. Behind him, Marlowe could see other men taking positions in the street, at least 6 or 7, all armed. Someone had recognized him and spread the word. The $15,000 bounty had brought out every gun in town. Marlowe could have surrendered. He could have dropped his weapon and raised his hands and let them take him alive. There would have been a trial, testimony from the Baxter sister, probably a hanging, a clean end to a dirty story. But Jack Marlowe had spent too many years on the other side of situations like this. He'd seen too many wanted men give up without a fight, seen the fear and resignation in their eyes as they accepted their fate. He'd always despised that weakness, that willingness to let other men decide your destiny. So he drew his gun, not at Holloway, but at the nearest window, shooting out the glass and diving through in the same motion. The shotgun blast tore through the space where he'd been standing, and then he was outside, rolling to his feet, running for his horse. Bullets kicked up dust around his boots. He heard men shouting, heard the metallic clicks of hammers being cocked. He made it to his horse and swung into the saddle, but before he could dig in his heels, a rifle shot caught him in the back. The bullet punched through his left lung and exited just below his collarbone. Marlowe gasped, tasting blood, but he got the horse moving anyway. He galloped out of Perdition with a dozen men firing after him, their bullets whistling past his head like angry wasps. He made it to the edge of town before a second shot hit him in the side, just above his hip. The pain was extraordinary, but pain was something Marlowe understood. He'd inflicted enough of it to know how to endure it. He rode for an hour, leaving a trail of blood that any competent tracker could follow. His vision kept blurring, and he had to concentrate to stay in the saddle. Finally, his horse reached a small canyon with high walls and a trickle of water running through it. Marlowe slid off the saddle and collapsed against a boulder. He could hear riders in the distance getting closer. The posse from Perdition, following his blood trail. He checked his weapons. 2 bullets left in his revolver, a rifle with 4 rounds. Not enough to fight his way out, but enough to make sure they earned their $15,000. The riders appeared at the canyon entrance, silhouettes against the setting sun. Deputy Marshal Holloway in the lead, his clean-cut face now grim with determination. They approached slowly, cautiously, guns drawn. Marlowe raised his revolver with a shaking hand and fired. The bullet went wide, striking rock. The posse opened fire, and Marlowe felt new impacts chest, shoulder, leg. He fell sideways, his gun slipping from his fingers. The shooting stopped. He heard boots crunching on gravel, heard men's voices discussing whether he was dead or just playing possum. Holloway knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. Marlowe's eyes flickered open, and he looked up at the young deputy's face. For a moment, he saw himself as he'd been 7 years ago, righteous and certain, believing in the clear distinction between good men and bad men. Then that moment passed, and all Marlowe saw was another man come to collect a bounty. No different than he'd been. No better. Just luckier. Marlowe tried to speak, to say something profound or defiant, but his lungs were full of blood, and all that came out was a wet gurgle. Holloway stood up and holstered his weapon. He told the other men to get the body on a horse. They'd bring it back to Perdition for identification. $15,000 would be split 7 ways. Someone made a joke about it. Something about easy money. The men laughed as they grabbed Marlowe's arms and legs, hauling him toward a horse like he was cargo. Like he was just another dead outlaw at the end of just another hunt. Jack Marlowe died hearing that laughter, died being handled the same way he'd handled so many corpses, and his last thought before the darkness took him was that this was exactly what he deserved.